Airship Italia was doomed. Its commander, General Umberto Nobile, watched the polar ice field getting nearer and nearer as his craft dropped faster and faster towards it. "Stop all engines," he yelled, hoping that at least there would be no fire or explosion on impact. Moments later, there was a cry of "the wheel is dead," which meant that there was no chance of choosing a landing place. Then came the crash. It was 10:33 a.m. on May 25, 1928. Nobile, hurled out of the cabin, was alive but unconscious on the ice, his right arm and right leg broken. One man was dead and 8 others were on the ice in varying degrees of shock. Those who had their wits about them were looking up at the partly wrecked cabin where the 6 men who were still aboard were busy throwing every sort of equipment, food, fuel, ammunition, a tent, even out onto the ice. Then the tragedy turned to a nightmare which was to haunt the survivors the rest of their lives, for the stricken airship, now considerably lightened, was caught in a gust of wind and began to rise. 6 terrified faces, which swiftly got smaller and smaller, could be seen by the watchers on the ground as the Airship drifted into the distance, be seen again. Never to that was only the beginning of one of the worst of all polar disasters. It was to end with Nobile alive, but a pariah, blamed for the loss of Italia and some of his men, accused of incompetence and cowardice because he allowed himself to be rescued before and not after the rest, and branded a murderer. The man who had been the hero of all Italy and millions more around the world, found himself regarded as an outcast, shunned by his fellow men. Was this simple justice or monstrous injustice? Nobile was an engineer, his title of general being an honorary one. In 1926, he had flown across the North Pole in Norge, which he had designed, from Spitsbergen to Alaska. Also aboard the airship was the greatest living explorer, Roald Amundsen. It was Mussolini who gave Nobile permission to go to the pole again in his new airship Italia. This time the object was to go to the pole and back. Also to drop scientists there to study conditions. The Italia set out from a base at Spitsbergen with a mainly Italian crew. She was a small airship. Her keel 325 feet long, with gas bags containing 500,000 cubic feet of hydrogen, and able to fly at 75 miles per hour in still air. First man to have reached the South Pole back in 1911. The 2 men had publicly quarreled after the trip, the world siding with Amundsen, who caused Nobile of incompetence, to the fury of Italy's ambitious, aggressive dictator, Benito Mussolini. The first 2 survivors of the crash to be rescued were Zappi and Mariano, who had set off from Nobile's camp to seek help. By the time the Russian icebreaker Krasin came across them, they were little more than half-crazed human skeletons. She reached the North Pole safely, and an oaken cross, presented to Nobile by the Pope, was wrapped in an Italian flag and dropped overboard. The wind was rising and Nobile decided that it was too dangerous to lower the scientists in their rubber raft onto the ice. They would have to return another day soon. Fog was hemming the airship in and the wind drove it off course eastwards, then almost halted it in the sky. Broke under the strain, while jagged pieces of ice were flicked from the propeller blades ominously close to the gas bags. Then, 20 hours after leaving the pole, came the crash off northeast land northeast of Spitsbergen. Fortunately, the radio operator, Giuseppe Biaggi, grabbed his set just before the crash and, while those able to move were setting up the tent, he began to signal for help. As well as Nobile, another man had a broken leg. And the only cheering thing that happened was that the general's little dog Titania, knocked out by the crash, came to and bounded towards her master as he lay wrapped in a blanket in the tent. A new horror occurred that night. A series of terrifying crashes indicated that the ice floe which carried them had become separated from the main ice field. A split might even happen on the floor of the tent. Biaggi kept at his post night and day, but though he could receive messages, his own did not get through. And all the while instruments showed that they were drifting east. The next crisis erupted. The Expedition's Swedish scientist and only Arctic expert Professor Malmgren announced he was going to get help with the 2 Italian naval officers of the party, Commanders Zappi and Mariano. A stunned Nobile was too weak to argue, though he knew the danger of splitting up. However, just before they went, Malmgren shot a polar bear, which he saw lurking outside the tent. He grabbed Nobile's Colt and 3 shots in swift succession at least left those who were staying put with plenty of meat to sustain them. On June 6, Biaggi's call for help was heard and the several groups of rescuers at last had some idea of where to look. The tent was dyed red with landing markers which had been thrown overboard from the airship, but it was only a tiny spot in an endless wilderness, hard for today's planes to find, let alone 1928 models. Meanwhile, the strongest icebreaker in the world, the Russian Krasin, was cutting its way through the polar ice. The noble Amundsen, forgetting his quarrel with Nobile, flew north in a Latham hydroplane and was never seen again. Other planes flew over the tent but failed to spot it. Then a Swede in a Fokker with skis landed on the ice and took off Nobile. Weakly he protested that he must be last, not first, but the Swede was under orders, so Nobile and his dog escaped. When the pilot returned to the camp to make further rescues, he had an accident while landing and his machine overturned. Not until July 12 were the rest rescued, not by plane, but by the Krasin. She had already picked up 2 near-crazed human skeletons, Zappi and Mariano, who had been forced to leave Professor Malmgren, crippled by frostbite, to his fate. Horror had been mounting upon horror, or so it must have seemed to Nobile, but now that the survivors were safely on board, he must have felt that the long nightmare was over. He was wrong. For him it was about on his second attempt to rescue the men left at Nobile's base camp. The Swedish pilot made a bad landing and the ski plane overturned, to begin all over again and to add disgrace to his torment. As polar explorers searched desperately for signs of Italia's crew and Amundsen's plane, every country involved with the affair, and many who were not, demanded an inquiry. And gossip swiftly spread that everything that had gone wrong was the fault of Nobile. The fact that he lay helpless and in pain until his rescue made no difference. Mussolini reacted furiously at the slights on his nation's honor, but someone had to take the blame. With evil tongues saying that he had demanded to be taken off first, Nobile, broken with grief at the disaster, was made the scapegoat. He resigned from his profession and was forced to leave his homeland and live in Russia. Not until the fall of Mussolini and the end of the Second World War, in which he did useful work in America, was he reinstated and allowed to work again in Italy. The case against him simply will not stand up. It would be wrong to call him a hero, but if he was a villain, how many other dauntless explorers have been villains too? It is surely not a crime merely to fail. Those who flew in aeroplanes and airships in the early days of aviation knew the risks they were taking. It was Umberto Nobile's misfortune to find himself trapped in a nightmare. His own country's wretched, vain dictator. There were cracks like rifle shots as some of the Italia's framework. There are thousands of great videos like this on the channel. Please take a look, please share and subscribe, or visit the Bonswivit channel on eBay, which has over 250,000 rare and collectible items listed.